Hi kindergartners, first graders, and second graders. It's Miss Clark, and I miss you guys. It feels very strange to not be in our classroom doing school like we normally would be doing. So, we are going to be doing school from a distance using technology until the end of the year, and we're just going to do our best, and it's going to be an adventure. So, our first lesson is going to be our Bible story. Now, before we get started, I want to show you guys a couple things. In your packets, you should have something that looks like this. If you're in first and second grade, you'll have a green sheet of memory verses. If you are in kindergarten, you will have a yellow sheet of memory verses. Now, everyone should also have a piece of paper that looks like this each week. And what you are going to do is write your memory verse on this piece of paper. Please write it clearly and very neatly, and decorate the border part of it as well. And then you can take a picture and send it to me. And this is what we're going to do instead of you guys reciting your memory verse to me every Friday. Okay, so we'll set those aside and get ready to start our Bible story. We are so used to praying each morning and taking prayer requests from everyone who wants to share and praying over those things. Because we have to do things a little differently, if you would like to press pause on this video and find a family member, you can spend a few minutes praying for some very specific things if you would like, okay? So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and say a small prayer over our Bible story before we get started. Dear Jesus, thank you so much for the gift of your love and the gift of this life that you've given us. I want to pray that you would be with each kindergartner, first grader, and second grader right now as we learn to do school a little bit differently from home. I pray that you would be with our story. Please help us to learn something new about you and the world around us. Thank you for always loving us, for protecting us, and for always looking out for us. In your name I pray. Amen. Okay, so our Bible story that we're going to read for this week is actually a story that we read before spring break. However, we did not do all the activities that go with the story, so we're going to finish up this lesson before we move on. This is called Moses Goes Home, and we're actually going to read our memory verse before we start our story again. Our memory verse is found from Joshua 1:9. And it says, "Remember that I commanded you to be strong and brave. So don't be afraid. The Lord your God will be with you everywhere you go." Joshua 1:9. So be thinking, who in this story is God asking to be strong and brave? Now before we begin, I want you to remember that Moses is with the Israelites in the desert. And are the Israelites the easiest people to get along with? No. The Israelites disobey sometimes. They complain, and they just make it hard for Moses to lead them. Moses is just trying to help them and give them messages from God. But they are a very difficult group of people to get along with. So, let's read our story. Moses goes home. There was excitement that spread through the camp of Israel. At last, the Israelites were at the border of Canaan, the promised land. 2 years had passed since the meeting tent had been built. If you remember, the meeting tent that we read about maybe a month or so ago, the meeting tent was a special place to meet and talk to God, okay? Now it had been 2 years since the meeting tent had been built. And in these 2 years, God had tried to teach the people to be his own special children. Now there were 12 spies that were sent into the land to find out what it was like. When the spies came back, the Israelites gathered around to hear what they had to say. And at first, they were excited. As the men told about the beauty and marvels of the land, they also talked about how there were grapes so big that it took 2 men just to carry one bunch of them. Then 10 of the spies started telling how big and strong the people of Canaan were. The Israelites grew frightened. "We can't attack those people," said the 10 spies. "We felt like grasshoppers. and we looked like grasshoppers to them. And the Israelites began to wail loudly. The other two spies, Caleb and Joshua, were so upset they tore their clothes. "Don't turn against the Lord," they cried. "Don't be afraid of the people in that land. We will chew them up. They have no protection, but we have the Lord. So don't be afraid." It was no use. The people started saying, "Let's get a leader and go back to Egypt." They were so angry that the Israelites started to pick up stones. They wanted to kill Joshua and Caleb. Just then, the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting. The people had gone too far this time. God said to Moses, "I have forgiven these people, but I will make this promise. All of these men saw my glory. They saw the miracles I did in Egypt and in the desert. But they disobeyed me, and they have tested me too many times. So not one of these people will see the land that I promised to their ancestors. Only 2 people will get to go into the promised land, Caleb and Joshua." So for another 38 years, the people wandered around, camping wherever God's cloud showed them. They ate manna, and they even wore the same clothes every day, but they never seemed to wear out. The people also complained. They made Moses' life miserable. As the older people began to die and the children grew up into adults, they were not much better with the complaining. And finally, Moses lost his temper. That means he got really upset. The people were camped in the desert of Zin, where there was no water. And just as the parents had done, the current Israelites turned against Moses and Aaron. "Why have you brought us from Egypt into this terrible place? It has no grain, no figs or pomegranates, nothing to eat, and there's not even any water to drink." Moses and Aaron bowed face down at the door of the meeting tent. God told them to speak to the rock so that water would flow out for the people to drink. Unfortunately, Moses and Aaron lost control of their tempers. Moses said, "Now listen to me, you group of complainers. Do you want us to bring water out of this rock?" And he hit the rock twice with his stick. Water began pouring out. Moses and Aaron had not done what God had said, though, and they had taken all the credit for bringing the water out of the rock, instead of giving the credit to God. So God said, "You did not honor me as holy before the people, so you will not lead them into the land that I will give them." Can you imagine how sad Moses and Aaron must have felt? They could have said, "It was the people's fault." But they did not. They chose to accept God's decision respectfully. Later on, Aaron died, and his son, Eleazar, became the high priest. The people cried for 30 days. They knew it was their fault that Aaron did not get to go into the promised land. Soon, they would need a new leader too. God told Moses to set Joshua apart as the new leader of Israel. Remember, Joshua was one of the spies that went into the promised land. Moses did not complain about God's decision. He did all he could to prepare the people for what was to come, but he was disappointed. Once, Moses even tried pleading with the Lord. He decided to give praises to God for his greatness and his power, and Moses asked, "Please let me cross the Jordan River. Let me go and live in the land of Canaan." God replied, "That is enough. Don't talk to me any more about it. Go and climb to the top of Mount Pisgah. Look to the west, the north, the south, and the east. land from a distance, but you will not cross the Jordan River to live in the land." Moses spoke to his people one last time. He repeated the story of how they had been freed from slavery in Egypt, and he described all of the miracles God had done. He taught the people a special song from God. He gave each tribe a blessing. Then Moses turned, and all by himself, he climbed up Mount Pisgah. The people cried as they watched Moses go. He was 120 years old, but he was still strong. Moses had been like a father to the Israelites, even though they gave him a hard time and complained a lot. The people cried for 30 days after he was gone, and then they began to turn their eyes to Joshua and the Jordan River. Up on the mountain, Moses looked over the Jordan River to the land in which he had hoped to live. And Moses began to talk to God. God showed Moses the promised land as if it were up close. Then God showed him into the future. Moses could see the Israelites living happily in Canaan. He saw the time hundreds of years later when Jesus would be born, grow up, and then die on the cross. Moses cried as he watched the Israelites turn on God's Son and kill him. Moses saw the gospel spread throughout the world, and he saw the trouble at the end of time when Satan tried one last time to kill those who followed God faithfully. Then Moses saw Jesus come again. Only this time, he wasn't a tiny baby. He was the King of the universe. He would take his faithful ones to heaven to live with him forever. Moses' tears dried up and he smiled. And then he peacefully lay down and he died. That was not the end of the story, though. Angels buried Moses. Later, God sent a special angel named Michael to raise Moses from the dead. Satan was furious. He believed that once people died, they belonged to him forever. No one had ever been raised from the dead before. He told Michael that Moses had sinned and didn't deserve to live again. But Michael reminded Satan that Moses had repented of his sin. That means he said sorry for his sin and he asked God for his forgiveness. He had repented of his sin and believed that the sacrifice of God's Son would one day pay for it. And that was enough. God took Moses to heaven. Just think of how Moses must have felt. He had thought he was being punished by being kept out of the land of Canaan, when all the time God had been planning to take him to heaven. Moses is in heaven now. He knows that Jesus will be coming back soon, and maybe he will come with him to get us. Let's go back to our memory verse and read that again. Remember that I commanded you to be strong and brave, so don't be afraid. The Lord your God will be with you everywhere you go. Joshua 1:9. So in our story, we see that God has called Moses to be strong and brave in God's name. God gave Moses a lot of responsibility. He had to take care of all the difficult and complaining Israelites who had a history of disobeying God. Okay? Now, it's very important that we see in our lesson that even though God chose Moses to be his special leader, Moses did not always get things right, okay? In our story, we saw Moses lose his temper. That means he got really, really upset. And we also saw Moses take all the credit for the water coming out of the rock, when that credit belonged to God, okay? So even though God is going to call us to be strong and brave and do good things for him, we may make some mistakes sometimes. But in our story, we learn that through Moses, we see Moses still had good things coming to him. God still had a good plan, even though he made a mistake. Moses thought he was being punished by not going into the promised land, and in a way he was being punished because he didn't follow exactly what God asked of him. But God's forgiveness allowed Moses to experience something even better, and he let Moses go to heaven. Now, the promised land sounds like a really cool place to be, but that's an earthly thing. And so by going to heaven, Moses actually received the better blessing, and God's mercy and forgiveness allowed that to happen. All right, thank you. We'll see you next time.